we need to get this to looking like this. And this is how we did it. Part 2 of major hull blister repairs. Hello, I'm Patrick.
And I'm Rebecca on the Sailboat Brick House, a Valiant 40.
We have had some comments, people asking, why don't we just go out and buy a new sailboat instead of fixing up this old 44-year-old sailboat? Buy a new sailboat? Well,
I'd rather have 500 blisters than spend 500 grand.
yeah, a new Swan 48 would be okay. But the reality is, a 44-year-old sailboat suits our economy just fine. And especially a Valiant 40. I don't know of any other design, especially with the interior layout, that I like as well as the Valiant 40. So these old boats, if you buy them at the right price, if they've been somewhat maintained, there's a lot of hidden value there. We used to flip houses. That is, we would buy old houses that needed work, fix them up, and sell them, oftentimes within a month, and make a comfortable profit. That is what helped to get Rebecca and I out retired and sailing at a fairly young age. And we see sailboats in the same way. Our Valiant 40 had a lot of tremendous value locked in it, and we just had to bring it out. I'm going to put my sunglasses on too because it's very bright out here. And
blinding on the sand and everything.
that's why I don't put sunglasses on my head most of the time. I always lose them. But yeah, these sailboats like the Valiant 40 has a lot of potential if you just can sail away on it, enjoy crossing oceans, and in these foreign countries where it's very reasonable, do the work to fix them up, which is what we have been doing. And I have been waiting for about 5 years to get to a place like South Africa to do all of the blister repairs. We knew it would be extensive, it would take a long time and a lot of work, but everything that you saw in the first video and you'll see in this video, all the blister repairs and all the painting, cost us about $4,000 US for materials and labor. That isn't counting my own time and labor, and it does not count the copper coat that's on the bottom. But we feel as though, just like flipping a house, we have increased the value tremendously. We may not sell the boat for a profit in the end, but we've had a very cheap place to live, we've had a lot of great adventures, and we'll certainly get a lot more for it than when we first started out. Anything you want to say?
No.
You have to say something. You say, yeah, if anybody has a Swan 48 you want to give us.
If anyone wants to give us a Swan 48, we're all ears. Go for it.
Yeah, but the reality is a new boat just is such a fast depreciating asset.
That's true.
You know, just like a car. As soon as you drive it off the lot, you'll never get what you paid for it again. And that's why we feel these old boats have a lot more value than any new boat ever can have. Any boat, even a new one, is a maintenance treadmill.
If you don't want to do work, don't buy a boat.
And that's part of it too. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty and work right alongside the helpers. You just can't be throwing money at contractors who oftentimes just screw things up. So get in, do the work yourself, get the proper tools and learn how to do it, and you can have a very nice asset. So let's get into the finish up these blister repairs, into the final fairing and sanding. So let's get to work. It was a lot of work to open up all of these resin blisters and prepare the craters for the laminating of new fiberglass with epoxy resin to get everything ready in process. The epoxy resin used is Gurit SP106 with slow hardener. And the fiberglass cloth is 1708. We got all of those materials from AMT Composites in Durban, South Africa. Oh, I forgot to mention in the last video, and I'll do it real quick here, with these fin rollers. When they get used, they get really plugged up with resin and they become useless. But they can clean up very quick and easily by using a paint stripping heat gun. Just melt that stuff out of there, give it a good brushing with a wire brush, and in just a couple of minutes, it will look like new. The two-part epoxy fairing compound we used is Seafair 600, which we also bought through AMT Composites. But as you can see, just using some putty knives or some sheetrock compound knives, they just weren't large enough to do an adequate job. We had to find a better system, a better application tool to help speed up the process and do a better job. So we started experimenting with some leftover fiberglass panels and also some plexiglass panels. And each had its own thickness and ability to fold perfectly into these outside curves and the inside curves. And the plexiglass panel was a little thicker, so it could be held very straight for very straight work like the keel to hull join curve. The only thing is there could be absolutely no defects on that application edge of these new screeds. But that was no problem. We just got out the router, picked up a piece of aluminum, which was actually an old curtain track, and used that as a straight edge for the router to follow to make a perfectly straight edge on both of these new screeds. You can actually see how wide that piece of plastic is, so I actually cut it in half lengthwise and made 2 screeds out of it. But you can see here, look at that router guide. That bearing was just about ready to fall off. I got lucky on that one. Good lesson to always check the set screw on the very bottom of that collar and make sure it's good and tight. Depending on which way the wind blew, we generally set up our old mainsail as a dust containment cloth, although the contractors working on the surrounding boats weren't quite so concerned where their dust blew. But what really helped out to contain our dust and make our cleanup much easier during the smoothing process of all that fairing compound was to use a little cheapy vacuum cleaner that hooked up to the dust collection system of the random orbit sander. And it didn't use traditional bags for filtering, it used water, which was a very great collection system. It saved us a lot of work, a lot of cleanup during this whole process. Hey. That's just amazing. This could be all over in the air, on the ground, on our work. I mean, the solid mud is about half of my finger deep. Incredible. So after all that sanding, we had to make sure that we got all the dust off of the surface in preparation for the next step in the process. We found that washing with a scrub brush on the end of a long handle with a lot of fresh water was not adequate. When the surface was dry, if you wipe your hand over it, there would always be a layer of residual dust that did not come off. So we found that wrapping a terry cloth towel around that scrub brush and then washing the boat, maybe with a little dishwashing detergent in the water as well, that eliminated all the residual dust. But we were absolutely sure to make sure that all of that dishwashing detergent was well washed away from the surface of the boat. Using the water hose, we washed at night because by morning the ground and everything else would be dry. However, during the day, if we had to wash the boat, we would use 3 buckets of water because we could not afford to use the hose and be slopping around in a mud pit. 1 bucket with clean water would first be used to wipe down the boat. We'd go over that with the next clean bucket of water and then follow that with a 3rd clean bucket of water. And it was one person's job then to continually be emptying out those water buckets and refilling them with more clean water. And this worked out really well. Occasionally we would go over the surface with a heat gun, just mildly, to make sure that everything was very dry. But otherwise it did come out extremely clean with that 3-rag, 3-rinse process. One day we ran out of the 2-part epoxy ready mix fairing compound, so we had to mix up our own using the epoxy resin. After stirring the hardener and the resin for a full 2 minutes, then we mixed in a spoonful of Cabasil and then started mixing in the micro balloons. Of course, there's other fillers that would be very sandable, but they weren't available to us. We had to use the micro balloons. And we had marked in the tin can with a magic marker the level of which to fill the can so we'd have just the right amount of micro balloons in the mix. So we could duplicate this mix time and time again very quickly with no guesswork. But the big problem was this stuff sags. No matter how much of any of the fillers we put in there and the Cabasil, it still ran, it still sagged. It was not easy to spread and get a nice even finish. It meant a lot of work with these longboards and all the sanding that we had to do. The only way you can get a good finish on these boats without a lot of waviness is with longboards and a lot of arm muscle action. There's no easy way. I searched and I searched, and I could only find one extremely expensive longboard that had a power cord attached to it, and that's made in Europe, and we just couldn't get that here. 58% import duties plus shipping and everything else. It's just cheaper to hire a lot of people with strong arms. So I made the longboards out of some scrap fiberglass panel that we had laying around, and they were just wide enough so where they would fit side by side on a long roll of sandpaper. Holes were drilled in the fiberglass board. The head where the screw, the flathead screw would fit, was countersunk. The little wood handle was glued and screwed to the board, and we would be all set. Some of these boards had 2 handles, some of the boards had 4 handles. It was nice to have the variety. And then a piece of rubber that I found laying around the yard was contact cemented, sometimes they call it contact adhesive, to the bottom of the longboard, and that would give a nice backing for the sandpaper. Conforming to some of these tight radiuses on the hull, one long piece of sandpaper did not work out, as it would buckle in the middle. It was far better then, so we found, to cut 2 or 3 pieces, which is best, to then run the length of a longboard. Spray-on adhesive just did not work well. It wasn't strong enough to attach the sandpaper to the longboard. So then we always use the contact cement out of the can. I checked with every contractor in the area, and they all said there is no easy way out of all of this hand longboard sanding and putting and fairing and sanding and putting and fairing and sanding day after day to get it right. Some people familiar with this type of work would call our boards short boards, because oftentimes on much larger projects, very high-end projects, boards that are 15 feet long would be used. That is 4.5 meters, and take 4 and sometimes 5 people to operate. But this is not a Marina Queen, it's not a race boat. What we're doing here turned out to be very acceptable and nice, even finish throughout, and very adequate for a hard-used ocean crossing sailboat. There are different techniques for finding the low spots or the high spots in the fairing process, but generally we could see them or feel them easily with our hand. But we added black, white, or blue pigment to the fairing compound, and that helped greatly to show where we were and where we needed to go with the fairing. But anytime we did find the low or the high spots that needed attention, we would generally circle them with a different colored magic marker one day, like red, and maybe a green one on another day to help avoid any confusion. And the day finally came to where we could mark the waterline. We raised it up yet another inch, and that would be a total of 3 inches from the original waterline as this boat came from the factory. And before we ever got started on this project, we put pieces of blue tape along either the cap rail or the rub rail, and then measured down from there to the existing waterline to preserve those measurements and try to get them back at the end of this project. So all of those measurements then were measured straight down from their individual station and marked with a magic marker on the hull of the boat. And then we took a fishing line and strung it up and taped it to each one of those measurement points. Then it took a lot of eyeballing and moving that fishing line up and down just a hair, and more tape to hold it in new places to get that curve that existed before we ever got started on this project. Once that was accomplished, then we took blue tape and followed the fishing line just to the top side of it, where then the fishing line could be pulled away and we had whatever water line that was left. This was not a perfect system, but we did the best we could with it. If you know of a better way of getting back that water line, then please leave the information in the comments down below, and everybody, I'm sure, will benefit from it. All the fairing and sanding was done. Now we were finally in the home stretch. We used all epoxy resin and all epoxy fairing compounds on this project, so osmosis, the intrusion of water into these surfaces, just would not be a problem. However, I still wanted to give 4 coats of epoxy resin below the waterline so that we would have a nice, hard, evenly consistent skin. in preparation for the copper coat anti-fouling that we would be putting on, and just to make me feel better about the project. Following standard epoxy mixing instructions, we mixed our slow hardener with the resin at least 2 minutes before applying it to the hull, rolling it on and then smoothing it out with a roller that we had cut in half. And we applied it wet on wet. That is, one layer that we applied, once it just set up and it was still a little tacky to the touch, we went on and applied the next coat. And this gave excellent adhesion to each successive coat. Four coats of 2-part primer, around and around until we just ran out of primer to use. This was some South African made stuff that was recommended by one of the contractors in the yard. So it wasn't a name brand that the most international people would recognize. And of course, everywhere in the world, there's got to be a bug that just feels like they've got to jump into wet paint. All the surfaces were sanded with 320 grit paper with a random orbit sander before priming. And I would have put a lot of money on saying that everything was perfect. There were absolutely no blemishes. And how wrong, how much money I would have lost on that bet. It's amazing what primer will show up in the way the tiniest little defects. So we use this stuff called spot putty. It looks like tar, but it dries extremely fast and hard. And it was just the perfect putty, 1-part putty for filling up all these tiniest little dings or scratches or defects. And then those would get sanded with 320 grit paper, and then they were ready for painting. We wouldn't prime over these. Pretty rough looking, isn't it? But that's just as smooth as anybody could do with this stuff. So it did take a little bit of extra sanding. We went through 3 of these cheapy little vacuum cleaners that uses water for collection rather than a dust bag. The bearings inside just kept burning out. But it wasn't just those little black patch spots that we used the spot putty on. The entire hull where it was primed got sanded again with the 6-inch random orbit sander with 320 grit paper. But we also used the little home sander with the same grit paper in some of the areas that were a bit more curved and more difficult to get to with the big 6-inch random orbit. Sippo was on the spray gun with 3 of us doing everything that needed to be done to make it possible for him to just keep on spraying around and around the boat. We moved the scaffolding, his hoses, and one man was dedicated to mixing up the 2-part paint. And again, that was just generic paint made locally that was suggested by one of the local contractors. That is our old mainsail covering up the catamaran in front of us. They just had their boat painted, and we don't need any oopses with their paint job. Sippo certainly had the hardest job. He couldn't stand around and take a little break every now and then. Always moving, always spraying 4 coats around and around until we ran out of paint, and that was good enough. So after 4 coats, we were done. What a nice feeling. I mean, I'm the boss, I'm paying the bills. I don't want a Marina Queen, but these guys said, no way, we're not done. And I lost that argument. I didn't have the heart to tell them that this is a long-range, hardcore, hard-used cruising boat. I don't need an absolutely perfect job, but they would not relent. There were just the tiniest little defects, the tiniest little pinholes. Primer and paint does not cover defects. It only accentuates them. And I did not have the heart, though, to tell them that good enough was good enough in this case. So they went at it. They sanded down the white, lit up all the tiniest little defects you could imagine, and took special viewing from one angle or another to see them, and then started wet sanding, and also some dry sanding, all with the 320 and actually 400 grit paper, all to get this surface ready for another 4 coats of white paint. The green and white color combination is the age-old Valiant 40 color scheme. And this time we got away with 4 coats of green, and we didn't have to put on 8. So now all that was left to do is put on the newly chromed trim on the hose pipe, give it a good application of copper coat, which is video number 57, and then apply prop speed to the propeller and shaft. Prop speed is a silicone finish that has worked out very well for us in the past, and we'll do a video on the prop speed application one of these days. And after 8 months of work, this boat is finished and ready to go back in the water. And we fully believe that it's stronger and better now than when it rolled out of the factory in 1976, 44 years ago. And just like the houses that we used to fix up and sell for a profit in Rhode Island, we fully believe that this boat is now worth far more than when we started out 12 years ago. We have all the receipts for the materials and all the time cards for the labor, but it would take hours and hours to figure it all out to get an exact amount of cost. So Rebecca and I will both guesstimate that the materials and labor to do all the blister repairs, and this is not counting the cost of the copper coat bottom, but it cost us about $4,000 US to do this blister repair and the paint job. But the work isn't done. Rebecca wants to put on lithium batteries and also a hybrid hot water heating system. So we'll go to Richards Bay and move on down to Cape Town, where we'll take care of those projects. But it's been a fun, great stop in Richards Bay. We went to the game parks and met a lot of great people. But like with every cruiser, there comes that date that you just have to leave.